Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is JW Creewall, aka Flex Daddy Righteous. Why do I do that with my hands? Okay, anyway, we have a tier list today. This is the expanded format tier list for the upcoming regional championships in Collinsville. And I wanted to make sure that I got this video out because I've had a lot of people say, JW, I don't know what to play. JW, these decks are very confusing. I hate the expanded format and I need some guidance. JW, Collinsville is coming up and I haven't tested. What do I do? And so I'm here today to bring you kind of my thoughts on the expanded format. Now, it's a little bit different than the standard format list that I did because I kind of view this more as a spectrum. There are a lot more viable decks in the expanded format, and because there are a lot more viable decks, there are going to be just weird matchups that, like, I have no idea how they go. You know, there are certain matchups where it's like, you know what? I'm not going to lie. I haven't tested it. There's just so many decks. Like, we're going to cover maybe 10 to 15 decks here in this video, and there are still maybe 10 to 15 more that are out there. So it's unreasonable to expect anyone to, to test every single deck and expand it. And there are certainly some kind of hidden decks that are out there. I don't know what they are, or else I would tell you. But I have a good idea of kind of the general form of the expanded format, and I want to give that to you today. So we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. I just want to explain kind of how I'm ranking things for the expanded format. Tier 1 are decks that I would expect to do very well. So I would expect these decks to make top 8. I would expect these decks to be somewhere in the top 16. And I would expect, reasonably for a deck in the tier 1 to win the tournament. Now, tier 2 are just decks that I think maybe are a step below tier 1, but I would have no problem seeing them, in the top 8, even taking a win. Like, these are decks that I just don't love myself, but they're very good decks and would not be shocked to see somebody come up with a list that wins the whole tournament. Tier 3 are decks that I think are fine, but maybe are not going to win the tournament and maybe won't even come into top 8. You may see a dabbling of them in top 16, but just they don't have quite what I think it takes to win in this expanded format. And then tier 4 are just decks that I don't think there are a lot of tier 4 decks because, to be honest, there are a lot of viable decks right now in expanded, but tier 4 decks are just decks I would never suggest somebody plays. So anyway, here we go. Let's get to it. We'll start with an old favorite, Garchomp. Now, Garchomp was a deck that was pretty popular last format. Obviously has the Aromatisse to move the energies around and you heal and things like that. This deck really gets hit in the form of Zacian decks or Zacian decks. So the Zacian decks, obviously have the metal weakness, but can one-shot the Garchomps pretty easily anyway. You don't really need the weakness to one-shot. And to be able to one-shot a Garchomp, that's like Garchomp's worst nightmare. So there are a few other decks that give it a little bit of trouble, but the biggest problem I see with this is the Zacian deck, which I do expect to have a significant presence in the expanded format. So solely for that reason alone, and the fact that there are other pretty solid one-shot potential decks, I give this deck a tier 4 rating. I would not suggest to anyone to play Gardevoir. Okay, moving on. We have another deck here. This is Buzzwole Garb, another favorite of the past formats. A deck that, people seem to like. I mean, it has some kind of decent matchups, I guess. And, being able to play one prize attackers, being able to play Garbodor is kind of cool. And pairing them together is kind of nice. It reminds us of formats past. And this is a deck that I've actually had some success with in the past. But, can't say I would recommend it. The first big reason is that Buzzwole and Garbodor don't go as far anymore. They're still strong cards, but the HP of some of these newer cards from Sword and Shield is just getting a little bit out of hand, that Garbodor doesn't quite feel like the monster that it was, and the Buzzwole certainly doesn't have the type matchup, the type coverage that it once had. And even like you think about, the Snorlax VMAX, which is a deck we'll talk about later. Buzzwole on its 4 prize turn with a Beast Energy doesn't even hit the knockout on a Snorlax VMAX. You know, it's like that's kind of crazy to think about. Usually when you have the Buzzwole and the Beast Energy, or like Buzzwole and you know, Diancie or something out on the 4 prize turn, you were knocking out anything that was fighting weak. That's not even the case anymore. And that's not to say that's the sole reason that Buzzwole is bad, but you just look at that as like, oh, that's a very obvious reason that maybe the damage output of Buzzwole isn't where it needs to be to do well at a tournament. Could not recommend this deck to anyone. I think there are a lot better 1 prize decks, and I'll name one that I've been testing a lot specifically, but I would put this at a tier 4. And again, this is a spectrum, this is a continuum, so don't say, you know, JW, you put my deck all the way at tier 4. Well, yeah, but you know, these are decks that I think are going to do well based on you know, the amount of testing that I've done. So if you've done a lot of testing with Guardian and you're like, dude, I have the secret spicy tech to beat Zacian, then by all means play it. But these are just what I am thinking about for the expanded format. So next man up is Darkrai. So Turbo Dark was quite a force in the last format. It didn't quite have the finishes, but it you know, in the top 8, but it you know, did pretty well just amongst the general population. It was very well represented, and just is a good deck. Now this deck I think gets even better heading into Sword and Shield, with the biggest addition for me is Quick Ball. And that is what this deck has, you know, always wanted, is just more Ultra Balls. And we basically get that in Quick Ball. So, you know, Quick Ball, being able to discard a card, get a Shaman or a Dedenne out of your hand or out of your deck for the first turn is extremely, extremely good. And Dark is one of the decks that I think can overcome this first turn no supporter rule. I think you up the counts of Shaman and Dedenne. Maybe you go 3 Shaman, 1 Dedenne, or 2 Shaman and 2 Dedenne. But in any case, upping those ability draw counts so that your first turn still feels like you know, you're doing things, right? You're going to be able to get energy. I've gotten pretty reliably like 4 to 5 energy out on my first turn just using ability Pokemon, because they're just so strong, because I have Quick Ball. I have those extra search outs for that. So for that reason, being able to overcome the turn 1 and just being as consistent as ever, having the ability to use Guzzlord, Little Mew, you know, Darkrai, GX's attack is still amazing, so I take this and put this right at tier 1. This is one of the decks that I would consider for Collinsville. Let's look here. All right, next man up, Zacian. Now Zacian is one of the newest cards from Sword and Shield, and you know, can hit some pretty insane numbers. Now you pair Zacian with Delmise, which adds an extra 10 damage. It's a bench sitter to all metal Pokemon's attacks, and then you also can use things like Choice Band, potentially Muscle Band. I don't know if I quite like that build, but you use Choice Band and a Delmise or 2, you're hitting 270, 280 on turn 1 pretty reliably. Now we do get Metal Saucer obviously in the new set. We have Max Elixir. We have the Doggo's ability, which is huge. I cannot understate how important being able to draw 3 cards on your first turn is, and potentially powering up an attack. It's actually just amazing. So I like Zacian a lot. I would say it's on the lower end of tier 1 just because of how linear it is. You know, things like Darkrai can have multiple, you know, 1 prize attackers. They can go in different routes. They have an auto 1-shot attack. Zacian doesn't really have that, but what it does have is just an ultimate consistency. Being able to get 3 energy down on turn 1 is very, very doable. Being able to take those turn 2, 270, 280, potentially even more knockouts, being able to use Guzma, having just that good draw, the good use of cards like Shaman and Dedenne and things like that, and then having the ability on top of that makes it a really good turn 1 deck. So I like this deck a ton. I would put it again on the lower end of tier 1. I don't, you know, it's kind of been hovering between tier 1, tier 2. A few of my friends played it at Cups recently and maybe didn't do so hot just based on that metagame, but I just think as a whole, this deck is so consistent, has a lot of the benefits of Turbo Dark with a few of the, you know, fewer of the drawbacks, I guess, or some of the drawbacks to Turbo Dark. In any case, it's kind of like Turbo Dark, just in a different flavor, and I like it a lot. So, tier 1 for you, Zacian. One of the best 1-prize decks, and I should almost say the best 1-prize deck in my opinion, is Ultra Necrozma. Now, Ultra Necrozma has some powerful tools that I like to use with it. You could use Muck, you could use Garbodor, but again, I don't like Garbodor in this format just because Pokemon have such high HP, and you know, for a deck like Zacian into Garbodor, they almost don't fear it because they can accelerate energy without using items. So like Turbo Dark maybe needs to blow a lot of items, and maybe you can catch them with a Garbodor late in the game. A deck like Zacian doesn't quite need to do that. In any case, Ultra Necrozma. Very, very strong deck. I like this deck a ton. It is one of my top choices for the format for the Collinsville Regional Championships just because it is just the best one prize deck. Can do 170 from turn 1. Silent Lab is an extremely strong card by itself and is one of the ways that this deck can overcome that turn 1. If you are going first with Ultra Necrozma, which I don't think is a bad thing. You can always try to slap down a Silent Lab and catch your opponent slipping. And so I like this deck a ton. I would say it's somewhere between, again, Tier 1 and Tier 2. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to put it at Tier 2. I think it's... there are some very simple and obvious counters. I think of like Noivern, things like Enhanced Hammer, things like... yeah, I mean, Noivern GX, whatever. In any case, there are some things that kind of scare me. The first turns can be kind of tough. Getting out Pokemon. Ooh, I'm making my desk shake. Getting out Pokemon can be kind of hard. And so I put it at Tier 2. Just the consistency isn't quite there. I like it a lot. I think it's a very good deck. But it's just not as consistent as a deck like Darkrai or Zacian. And I think for a large regional championship, you want to make sure that you have those that consistency built in. I'm getting a phone call. All right, let's finish up this tier list. Next up, we have Stall. Okay, so I've put a Lily's Pokédoll just to represent Stall in, you know, any form, right? This is just Pokédoll, whatever. I don't know. There's a bunch of different Stalls. You have like things where they utilize Pokédoll and Sableye. You have things where they utilize just large walls. You have things where they utilize the Regirock promo and then Ninja Boy it into various Pokemon. I mean, there's a lot of things that encompass the Stall archetype, but I will just say Stall is very, very poised to do well right now. However you build it, however you want to take it, I think Stall is a great choice in any form almost. It just feels like... you know, Stall did pretty well in its various forms in Dallas, and I don't think anything really changes. So I put Stall at, again, I would say somewhere between Tier 1, Tier 2, because, you know, there are things that the Tier 1 decks can do, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to go Tier 1 with Stall. I think it is a really, really great choice. If you have a good list, Stall is definitely a strong option for this tournament. Next man up, Zork. Long forgotten, much loved, the Dark Prince has returned. Zork as a deck. Now, turn 1 rules, I think really just hinder Zork to the point where I don't want to say it's unplayable because certainly someone will find a way to make Zork playable. But I definitely don't expect it to make the top 4, the top 8. I definitely don't expect it to win. I think it's a fine deck if you force your opponent to go second. Or excuse me, force your opponent to go first. But just losing the ability to bridge it, it makes it so that you might have to just build the deck differently. Maybe it just revolves around more quick balls, things like this. But Zork is a deck I am okay with, but again, I don't think its partner is that good. Garbodor doesn't one-shot with the Trashalanche. Obviously the N Garbodor Garbotoxin combo is still very, very strong, but I don't love this deck. I know not a lot of people have been testing it, and I think it just loses too much from the turn 1. I'm going to put it at Tier 3. I think still like an okay choice. I would not be shocked to see it make day 2 by any means, but not a deck that I like, and I think just gets harmed too much by the turn 1 rules. We have Trevenant and Dusknoir with Melodic, one of Pablo Meza's creations from the Dallas Regional Championships that did get top 8. I like this deck a great deal. I think it has a lot of potential, and I think a lot of people are considering it as a possible way, as a possible play for Collinsville. And so obviously with Dusknoir Melodic, you're going to use Melodic to go down on prizes, ace trainer your opponent, and then try to shuffle their hand back in with the Trevenant and Dusknoir GX. Oftentimes a very strong strategy. Now, there are ways, like if your opponent draws out of it, I've almost found that it's very difficult to recover because if they knock out your attacker, then it's going to be harder for you to whip up another one. But all that said, I do like Trevenant and Dusknoir. I think it's one of those decks that I feel is on the verge of tier 1 and tier 2. It's just a strong deck, has a lot of decent matchups, and you can basically cheese just about any deck in the format. It does take a little bit of sequencing prowess to make sure that you have, the right pieces at the right time. So I think it's a strong deck. The presence of things like Turbo Dark make it a little bit difficult. Obviously, you play weakness policy with this. And then things like Zacian, which can one-shot your dudes almost from the first turn on. I mean, pretty easily, pretty reliably. I put this at a tier 2. A strong choice if you're considering it. I definitely would recommend it if you're thinking about it and if you have a list for this. Sorry about those updates that keep popping up. But Trevenant and Dusknoir, good deck. Vespiquen, and I think to a lesser extent, Night March. They do different things. They are different, styles of deck. Vespiquen just aims to get as many Pokemon in the discard as possible, while the Night March deck aims to, get the right Pokemon in the discard. And so, but they're still Battle Compressor. They're still based around Battle Compressor, still based around the same concept of using DCE and hitting for big damage on one prize Pokemon. I like them both a lot. For Vespiquen, I have never loved Vespiquen more than Night March, but Night March has a lot of tools that Vespiquen doesn't have. I think most importantly, the reliable GX attacker in the Marshadow. The Marshadow GX is obviously a very, very good asset to a Night March deck where you can, attack with into like Darkrai for one shots pretty easily. You can attack into Snorlax V pretty easily. I just like it a lot. And then you also have Joltik with Electro Powers that you can hit those high damage numbers. I keep coming back to damage as something in the expanded format that I look to as a good deck, and I think that's pretty true. Last format, we didn't really have, outside of Roxy Chomp, a way for decks to hit those 270 numbers like in one turn, right? Roxy Chomp could do it. They could play their Roxys. They could get the Coco powered up and hit 270 pretty decently reliably, but now we have that almost with every single tier 1 deck. So besides Stall, but these are two good cards. I think their damage output is very good. I put Vespiquen again. I don't love it, and if people play counters to it, I think Vespiquen is a little bit more harmed because it takes a couple turns to get your attackers powered up. So I put Vespiquen at tier 3. Again, this is all a continuum, so please don't be mad if I put your favorite deck, Rahul, at tier 3. And then we'll put Night March at tier 2. I'm just a little bit more comfortable. It has a better track record than Vespiquen, and I think still a solid deck. I would put this Night March on the verge of tier 2, tier 3, and probably Vespiquen in the same. But again, we have to make choices in life, and this is where I'm putting these. Eggrow, my baby, my child, my infant, my love. I've been dreading this part of the video, to be honest, because Eggrow is not a deck that I love in this format. It's not a deck that I love. It's a deck that I think has some very obvious flaws. The first flaw being that in the last format, or at least in the format that I won with Eggrow, and to an extent last format as well, you didn't have these decks that were just able to one-shot so easily from the first turn on. And I just look at a deck like Zacian that can hit 270, just needing, an attachment and a max elixir, or a couple max elixirs, or a couple metal saucers, or if they went first on their first turn, maybe they got the ability off for 1 or 2 energy. I mean, it's very, very simple for a Zacian deck to hit 270, and that is what the Eggrow deck fears the most. That is what the Eggrow deck fears the most, is an opponent that can one-shot their Pokemon from the first turn on. Because if you're not able to get multiple super growths down, then it makes it really hard to mount those comebacks, because you oftentimes will need at least 2 Vileplumes out. Maybe they're 2 of the same Vileplume, maybe they're 2 different, but you need to slow your opponent down. If you don't end up slowing your opponent down, then it makes it harder and harder to win, because they have more access to either their attackers or their items, and that just gets a little bit out of control. So Eggrow, I think it's a fine deck if you're considering it. There probably are some changes that need to be made. I personally prefer, after having played with Rillaboom and without, I prefer a non-Rillaboom version, but I could definitely understand going the Rillaboom way. This deck to me slots somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3, but for now, I think it is on the better side of that. It's on the better side of this kind of spectrum here on tier 2. So that's where we'll put Humpty Dumpty for now. ADP Blounts. This is a very, very cool deck that emerged out of last format. The basic premise of this is you use Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, and use the GX attack for a double dragon energy. Power up all your guys, as you do with the ADP deck. And you then, after it gets knocked out, you start hitting for insane numbers with the Blacephalon. You can use the B-String and attach and just blow things up, right? And you take 2 knockouts, presumably on like a Dedenne and a Shaman or something like that. And then you almost set up auto-win matchups if you use ADP and are able to accelerate energy from the deck, right? Because if they don't take a knockout on your ADP and you knock them out and accelerate energy onto your bench Blacephalons, it's almost impossible for the opponent to win. So I really, really, really enjoy this deck. The problem with the deck is if your ADP gets knocked out too early, let's say you're forced to go first, let's say your ADP gets knocked out before you can get a turn 1 altered creation, that can be very, very problematic. It's not that, it's not extremely doable. The deck like Zacian would need the 2 Delmise out and a Choice Band and like presumably a Guzma to knock out your ADP. But it is possible, something like Darkrai could use the GX attack on Darkrai GX. But for all intents and purposes, this is honestly one of my favorite attacking decks. I like this deck a great deal. I think it's somewhere between tier 1 and tier 2, but I'm going to put it at tier 1. This is kind of my surprise deck that I haven't seen a lot of people talking about, but that I like a lot. I like it a lot. I think you should test it for yourself. It sets up these checkmate scenarios very, very beautifully, very quickly, and pretty easily as well. So I like it a ton for this next format. Now, Mewtwo saw some success in Dallas. It had 1 top 8, which was unfortunately revoked due to a DQ, but kind of showing the strength of the deck. I like Mewtwo a lot in the last format. Has some very strong properties to it, right? You can copy so many different attacks. You can use things like Boom Burst to swipe your opponent's field. You can use things like Sonic Volume to prevent them from attaching special energies. You can one-shot reliably with various attackers that you decide to play in the deck. And, I liked Mewtwo a lot last format. For this format, again, it struggles against Darkrai, which is one of the decks that I think is the safest pick to get points in Collinsville. And for almost that reason alone, and bad matchups against things like Eggrow, Trevenant Dusknoir, Silent Lab Necrozma, and Dalstall, I have to put it at tier 3. Someone will probably make a deck list that is good enough to make top 16, I would expect. It's just a deck that has so many options that it's never truly dead, but I don't love it for this format, and I have to put it down there. Next man up here, Blastoise got essentially obliterated by the first turn rule, but we do have another riser up, another contender in its place. Somebody has stepped up in the form of Frostmoth. So Frostmoth has been a deck that I've heard gain a little bit of traction, being able to use Lapras VMAX to one-shot things. The problem with this is that it takes a couple turns. You have to get your Moth down turn 1 and then hope they don't kill it and then get all your energy on the bench. And it can be kind of clunky. I don't love Frostmoth. I'm going to put it at tier 4. Coming down to the last few decks here, we got Snorlax VMAX, absolutely one of the most fun decks to come out of the Sword and Shield expansion. It's basically like a Mega Rayquaza, except that you don't have to use the tool to evolve, so you have a few more spaces in your deck for fun things that you can do. I like this deck a lot. It just goes ham pretty quickly, pretty easily, and its only real counter is Sudowoodo, so you probably have to play Muck in your Snorlax. Again, I think it's somewhere between tier 1, tier 2, probably on the lower end of tier 1 or the high end of tier 2. I like it a lot. I'm going to put it at tier 2 for now because I think there are some very obvious flaws. Sudowoodo being just a great hindrance to it, and also attacking with a 3-prize Pokemon without really having a backup attacker and relying solely on special energy can be kind of troublesome. So I'm going to put it at tier 2 for now, and I'm excited to see if that archetype performs. Last but not least, we have Garchomp Giratina. Garchomp Giratina, a very strong deck. Obviously, won Dallas by Hunter Butler last format, but doesn't have what it takes to overcome the first turn rule. Now, getting a first turn Roxy's drawing to 6 was obviously huge for the deck. You only played very minimal amounts of, turbo drawing Pokemon. You didn't really play that many Dedenne, that many Shaman, but all things considered, I think the deck still maintains a lot of its strength. Being able to hit those high numbers is very good. Being able to snipe is very good. Being able to GG end 2 Pokemon for 2 energy is pretty good. So I like this deck. I wouldn't quite put it at tier 1 because it can, it doesn't have the greatest, matchups to some of the tier 1 decks, but I think a very solid tier 2. Okay, this was a very cursory glance over all the decks in the format. Well, and again, not even all the decks in the format. We've gone over 10, 16 decks. So there's still a ton more to be explored. This is just where I'm seeing the format kind of filling out. And again, a lot of these tiers are very fluid, where one deck, if you really like that deck, don't think that I'm saying it's horrendous, except if you're in tier 4. You guys suck. But I mean, there are ways to build these decks to kind of bring your matchups up. These are just kind of what I've found from the format in terms of the games that I've played. And I think it's a very good, just cursory overlook on at least the mind of me, one single player who has nothing at stake for Collinsville. I have no, cards on the table here. I'm trying to give you my complete and honest opinion on, the best or worst decks in this format. So this is expanded for me in a nutshell. I think you can make a lot of these, certainly tier 1 or tier 2 decks work and, counter some of the other decks in those lists, in those tiers. But for now, we're going to sign off. That's what I have. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, please leave me a comment down below. That really helps this channel, helps me get seen by more people. Leave a like or a dislike. If you hated what I did today, please leave a dislike as well. That helps the algorithm a ton. So thank you guys again so much for watching. My name is JW Creewall. Catch me on Twitch at twitch.tv/FlexDaddyRighteous. And let's interact. Follow me on Twitter at RealJohnWalter. You're seeing it up here just above my cursor. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.